WisconsinEye's 2014 election coverage is brought to you by the Wisconsin Hospital Association. For over 90 years, a valued voice for Wisconsin hospitals, supporting high-quality, high-value care in communities like yours.
WisconsinEye coverage of the 2014 elections continues. We're interviewing Mr. Amar Kaleka of Franklin. He's a Democratic candidate for the 1st Congressional District. Amar, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thank you so much for having me.
Just as programming note, WisconsinEye appreciates the support of the Wisconsin Hospital Association, which represents more than 139 hospitals and health systems, for making these candidate interviews possible. Amar, I was struck by some of the things you said at your Democratic convention speech, and I want to use that as kind of, this is your first run for office, correct?
Absolutely.
Well, talk to me about the evolution, because it seems, is it fair to say that you're running because of the tragedy of August 5th, 2012, when you lost your father in the Sikh temple shooting?
It's fair to say that that was the impetus that began my exploration into what was wrong with our society, what was going wrong with our economy, what was going wrong with our benefit systems. So it's definitely fair to say that that was the ignition.
In that speech to the Democratic Convention, you said there are no words for the dark cave we were forced to enter, and I presume that's a reference to your family.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a Sunday morning, it's beautiful outside, you're going to church. On the way to church, I get a phone call saying, you know, your father's been gunned down, and 6 other people, and there's somebody running around the temple just shooting, you know, and we don't know how many people there are. It's total mass confusion. These tragedies, sadly, have become more and more routine in America. We might discuss some of that, but it really, really forced me and my community to enter into a phase of understanding and trying to organize and create a better response. So I ended up going back and forth to Washington, D.C. to discuss hate crime legislation, gun legislation, a progressive economy, veterans benefits. And I started to realize that the lawmakers there were career politicians. Mm-hmm. And they were there not to change laws or effectively make our society better. They were there for their own career, much like my opponent, Paul Ryan.
Well, prior to that Sunday morning, when you got that tragic call, you were doing what?
I was actually checking on a house that my dad said, hey, go to 13th, and it was 13th and Arthur. He goes, hey, check out this property, and let's see if we can pick it up, because we needed some housing for some employees that we had. They had no housing. Wow. So I just checked out the property, and I was driving to the temple.
Were you living in the 1st District then, or living in California?
Yep, living in both. I've consistently lived in both. I'm the only one of all the people running for this position that have been raised in Southeast Wisconsin. So I was raised in Southeast Wisconsin, and then at 24, I went to graduate school in Atlanta, in Savannah, Georgia, and then back and forth to Wisconsin. Okay.
Well, in the speech, you talked a little bit about your family. You said your parents fled religious persecution. Mm-hmm. You said your dad operated some convenience stores. You said he made a penny per gallon of gas, and your mom worked at Eagle Knitting.
Yep.
So, let's talk about your transition then, because immediately after the tragedy, as you said, you went to Washington to work on, according to your website, hate crime and gun responsibility.
Yep.
And elaborate a little bit more on what you found and when you went out there. Well, what changes were you seeking? What responses did you find?
Well, when you go to D.C., a lot of the rooms are closed to everybody, but because I was a victim of a tragedy, doors were flung open, and I was able to walk in and converse face-to-face with a senator or a congressman, Paul, multiple times. We're able to have these discussions and be frank with each other. And for gun responsibility, I was looking for 100% universal background checks.
And you're still looking for that?
I'm still looking for that. In fact, July 30th, Richard Martinez and I will be discussing that in Los Angeles. He's the father of, I think it's David Martinez, who was gunned down in Santa Barbara. And we'll be talking about that. We'll be talking about a gun solution plan.
And on your website, you say you're a former ROTC cadet.
I am.
And you make a point of saying no one is trying to attack your right to own weapons.
No, I own my own gun. it's not an attack on ownership of guns, it's an attack on irresponsibility of gun ownership or gun sales. We do know that there are many loopholes in order to sell guns. 100% universal background check would effectively close some of them, including certain online sales, including 3D printing of guns and being able to sell a blueprint. I mean, there's going to be a time in the next 2 years where you're going to be able to buy a blueprint for a temporary gun for $10. You're going to 3D print it and be able to use it for an armed robbery. Like, it's happening. We have to get out in front of it.
Would 100% background checks have stopped the gentleman that shot your father from buying a weapon, sir?
In this case, it's been argued both sides. He had a background check, but it was an effective background check. And there are those background checks. When we did have background checks installed, and we were really ramping them up, over 1 million people, I think this was 2001 to 2006, over 1 million people were stopped from getting a firearm. In his situation, we don't know if the NICS system or the background check system has been properly supported, because there are so many people on the other side arguing that we shouldn't have anything to do with gun legislation. Mm-hmm. So I think if we all agree and we all unite and say, look, background checks are firm, we need to support that system, we need to make sure the ATF has a chief, we need to make sure people are doing things, I think it could have effectively stopped him.
You say when you went out there to talk about 100% background checks, you found out that the power special interest groups. Do you want to explain that, sir?
Absolutely. I mean, 3 letters, NRA. Lobbyists are able to get in the pockets of candidates, incumbents, and I think that's exactly why Cantor lost, is because when you look at a candidate or an incumbent and you say, how do you have $5 million to run when everybody else has far less? Or Paul, how do you have $6 million? Everywhere else in the world, we call that a corrupt politician. Mm-hmm. Here, we've now created this weird game of corporations can influence politicians legally. And that's something that we're all going to try to fight. You know, Citizens United, we're all going to talk about that, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, Citizens United is on my list. But what changes for hate crimes did you go to Washington to try to lobby for?
And this we actually did succeed on. The change was statistics. Hate crimes are not being counted effectively. There was no category for Punjabi Sikh, which we have a number of hate crimes happening towards our culture because people confuse us with the Middle Eastern cultures. We're Indian. We're from a democratic country. We've fought against tyranny for over 1,000 years, including helping, effectively ousting the British government non-violently. You know, we got our independence that way. And people confuse us because we wear turbans and beards. But turbans and beards are a sign of a yogi, of a person who meditates. It becomes the highest icon of our faith. That means you've prayed so much that you didn't care about your material face or whatever happens, you know. So we did get that changed.
Why are you a Democrat? After you're forced, because of the tragedy, to take a look at America's political system, you made a decision to run as a Democrat.
Absolutely.
With this footnote, because you said in the speech, the Republicans asked you to run for the state assembly as a Republican. Mm-hmm. So why did you decide to run as a Democrat?
I think Democrats are very wise when it comes to building from the middle class out, building from the working class out, uniting and creating effective change through democracy. Republicans, I guess essentially my division is, I feel that they are the business class of America. They look at government differently than we do. We look at it as the people creating laws that help the people. And I think they effectively look at it as another business equation. So I think that's the biggest difference. I still look at it as a former teacher, I look at it as for the people, by the people.
And then why did you decide on running for the U.S. House of Representatives? Because there's a lot of other ways you could get on the political ladder.
Well, I looked at where we could affect the most change. Paul Ryan's seat was the place where we can affect the most change. I want to change national conversation and national laws. running for state assembly or for state senate, I'm not saying that's off the table for me. However, it was hard for me to transition from my career to a state seat. And so nationally, when I was asked, and I was asked by major leaders in the party, and I said, look, I'll consider it. When I looked at the numbers of the district, I believe this is the year that Paul Ryan can be beaten, even though it's a midterm. And as we've seen with Cantor, a number of people have gotten wise to the fact that this situation needs to be changed.
Do you consider the biggest issue, what you said, here's the way you put it at the convention: America is not supposed to be a winner-take-all society. Is that your biggest issue? If so, can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. The way I can elaborate on it is economy. We are now ranked, I think, 37th in the world for income disparity. 400 Americans make half of the nation's income. 400 Americans out of 200-some million Americans make half the nation's income. That disparity is the winner-take-all society. That is, hey, I'm Kingfish, I'm so smart, I built this corporation, I should get paid $75 million per year while my secretary makes less than $40,000 a year, but pays more in taxes percentage-wise than I do. Now, that's oligarchy. That's, we can get to a point where we say that's not democracy. That is not the American dream. That's not the way we built our country. And this disparity is causing dysfunction, and we see it everywhere.
How do we change that? If you could wave a wand and change a tax code, you would do what, sir?
If I was President Obama right when I came in 2008, I would have effectively went after the minimum wage. We're talking about 1010, but for me, it's 1147. If you get paid $11.47 as a minimum wage, that means if you work 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, you will be right above poverty. This would take 26 million people out of poverty instantly.
Okay. Let's talk about some major pressing issues. Medicare and Social Security are on track to go bankrupt.
Yeah.
How would your ideas on fixing those, sir?
It's got to be a bipartisan thing. We have to spend less, and we have to get more effective tax revenue. And so where would I get those? I would look at the corporations and say, look, there's these fly-by-night tax loopholes that we've created over the years. No other developed nation has these. One is a foreign sales tax. If you're selling this cup in another country, America does not tax you, though our patents and trademarks guard this cup. And you are a company in America, which means you are a brand leader, right? But you're Coke and you sell in Brazil. We don't bring tax revenue back to America effectively. We need to start doing that because it's our money, it's that legal money that keeps that brand recognized.
Your website said you would end corporate welfare. One example of that?
That's one example of that.
That's one example.
That's one example. The corporate welfare system is causing dramatic harm, like Walmart. And then in terms of Social Security and Medicare, in order to fix it, we also need to spend less. So how do I do that? Well, people who are born after 1960, I would longevitize the age which benefits begin. So for anybody born after 1960, instead of 65, I would move it to 67. Mm-hmm. Anybody born after 1970, I would move it from 65 to 70. The reason is because we're living longer. We are living a healthier life as Americans, and I believe we're going to live a healthier and healthier life. The German Chancellor, I think it's Otto von Mark, when he introduced it in Germany in 1886, he actually aimed for 70. And that's mathematically makes sense because we do know that when you retire, you could effectively work from 65 to 70.
Yeah.
So.
And our lifespans are aging. I just saw in the New York Times the average American is 77.
Absolutely.
You mentioned health care. The Affordable Care Act,
Yeah.
Has it been a success?
Absolutely. I mean, primarily there are no death camps that the Tea Party promised would happen. Second is over 7 million people are enrolled. In states like Kentucky, 700,000 people who were not covered before are now covered. That's 43% of the people that actually enrolled in Kentucky. All of these things are huge successes. And I think the biggest success is that the cost of healthcare has started to flatten. right? We just knew it was spiking. It was getting to the point where people were going bankrupt over their healthcare system. All of a sudden, somebody would get pregnant and somebody would say, oh, you have a pre-existing condition. Instead of us paying 86% or 85% of your pregnancy, we're only going to pay 10%. Ooh, that just went from having what you thought was a $3,000 baby to a $26,000 baby. And that we did know was causing us to, create, for lack of a better word, population control. Because people do decide to have children based upon economy. And we know that.
Do you think the Affordable Care Act should be just a stop on the way to a single-payer system, a universal health care system for America?
And that's a good question. I think that we need to weigh it out for the next probably 15 years, about 2025, 2030, and see how we're doing and see how this healthcare reform is aging and kind of working. A single-payer system, I think, would be effective, especially in America, as wide as it is, as large as it is. I think it works effectively in Canada, it works effectively in other places.
What are your thoughts on the immigration crisis now? 57,000 children, Honduras, and other areas of South America.
Well, as you know,
we have 10 or 11 million people here illegally, but I'm sorry, your thoughts?
No, you're hitting the nail right on the head. That's going to be next to the minimum wage, next to health care, Social Security, Medicare. The immigration problem is what we need to address, especially as congressmen. And I'm born in India, so I'm an immigrant. I was naturalized. And I do know that there can be a clean, clear path to citizenship. And I call it the crossroads. So we need to change this, and we need to do this fast. The crossroads is 4 different paths to citizenship. The Enlist Act, which means if you're here illegally, you can enlist in our armed forces, fight for us, and actually get citizenship. The DREAM Act, the Skills Act, and something I'm calling 448. 448 Act is if you come to this country to be educated, which there are a number of people. You're coming to our universities because we have one of the best systems in the world, right? If these people come to be educated, after 4 years and they have their university degree, we offer them 4 years residency. In that 4 years now, they don't have to get married into citizenship, and they don't have to work for a major corporation that's going to pay for their legal standing. Instead, they start their own small businesses. They become part of our society. After 8 years, so after 4 of schooling and 4 of residency, they can be offered a clear path to citizenship. Effectively, we'd be drafting the best in science, technology, engineering, and math for the future. And that's a clear path. And we have to acknowledge, as Americans, we have not had a great immigration system for the last 30 years. It's been, for most people, it's difficult to understand. There's still a quota system that doesn't make sense, that's archaic. There's only a certain amount of people that can come in from China or India or from larger countries, but then there's a larger population that can come in from Western Europe. So we have to look at all these things and address them.
What about the unique challenges posed by 57,000 young children as young as 4 who have come across the borders? You've heard the voices in Washington, the protests, don't bring them near.
Both sides, right? Yeah.
Where do you come down on how we should respond to those?
I think that we do need to effectively take care of our border. We've asked the governors of those border states to give us a budget that they would require from the federal, government. If we can effectively take care of this border, and there are people who are coming in on humanitarian crisis, and by the UN they are labeled refugees, it's a completely understandable condition. Now when it's an illegal person who cannot substantiate that they are,
because
harmed.
they're 6 or 7 or 8 years old, correct?
Exactly, they can't substantiate it, right? But their parents or somebody else can substantiate it. But when they're 6 or 7, it's this gray area that's very difficult. We have to get them into a process that we understand and we can deal with. But we also have to understand that what's happening on the other side of that border is catastrophe. And we keep looking at the Middle East. Well, what's going on south of our border is affecting us economically. I can show you. The gun trade that goes in and out from America to Mexico is the largest gun trade in the world, right? Back and forth, the marijuana trade or the drug trade that's coming up from Mexico is the largest in the world. And these things that are happening simultaneously across our border we as a government aren't going, hey, let's look at that problem. Let's look at the deep-rooted problem. Instead, we're looking at it just very superficially and saying, oh, citizen or people are illegally coming over the border. Well, we have to attack all three on the front and actually get to the root.
You just mentioned marijuana, and I find on your website you want to decriminalize.
Absolutely.
Is that purely because of cost reasons? Because you say that some of our inmates cost up to $80,000 a year. Is it a cost or is it a social?
It is both. We've had this, I mean, amazingly defunct war on drugs. We've spent over $1 trillion on fighting drugs, and we've seen that it's actually escalated drug use. You know, so when we're talking about decriminalizing marijuana, we're saying, hey, if somebody is caught by the police for having marijuana or using marijuana, instead of sending them to prison, let's send them to healthcare facilities and say, you have a problem, you are addicted to a drug. That would effectively build our healthcare system rather than building our prison industrial system, which we're doing right now. And the difference is punitive justice versus restorative justice. And that's where every time we side with punitive justice, right, we're not fixing America.
Okay, those are all the inmates there for nonviolent drug offenses that you allude to.
Absolutely. Including alcohol offenses.
Right. Yeah. There's a national debate over same-sex marriage. Just quickly, your position on that?
I believe everybody should have the right to be married and get into fights with their spouse just like I do. I also think for Republicans, if we're going to slim down the government, we have to do it in these ways. If we're going to keep fighting over Roe v. Wade, you know, civil rights that are obvious, it's equal system, that's where we can slim down the government, because we don't need to spend $5 million arguing this any longer.
And in some of your speeches, you say that we're in a rigged game.
Yeah.
For that reason, I'm asking you this: would you support a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, the whole issue of campaign finance?
Absolutely, absolutely. At this point in time, we can see that politicians are being bought out left and right, and the results, the reason we can see it empirically is we can say, oh, less and less laws are being passed or reformed. Oh, wait, both the House are being polarized. They're being bought on both sides and now just being pulled apart, and nobody's finding a middle ground. When we can't find a middle ground, we shut down the government. When we can't find a middle ground, we don't pass budgets that effectively pay 21 million government employees. So we know that there needs to be a change on that, and I think a constitutional amendment, whatever we can do to overturn Citizens United, I think that's something we have to do. The more rights we give corporations, the less we have.
Members of Congress, of course, play a role in international relations. What do you think have been the lessons for America of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? When should we commit, I'll use the term boots on the ground, to a foreign country?
I think what we've learned with everything that's been going on for the last probably 30 years with our fight against the Taliban or extremists is it's not one country versus them. It's a group of allied countries that are versus an extreme, you know, situation. So we have to lead when necessary, but I think we have to start leaning on the United Nations and saying, you guys need to lead. You guys need to take that allied force in there before we come in there, because they're not going to become more and more effective at fighting tyranny unless we give them the opportunity to, right? And every time we enter a situation, as soon as we leave, there's a power vacuum. The United Nations needs to step in immediately in that power vacuum, and they need to be conversed with beforehand to go, when we leave, you're going to be there. You know, not, hey, that country is going to be there, because that country is obviously in turmoil. Look at Iraq, you know, the Ukraine situation. There's just so many situations abroad. We also, as soon as we start leaning on the UN, we'll be able to focus on more at home, look at our border, look at what we need to do to create a better economy, then we can help the world again.
You and I have read with interest the disclosures as a result of the documents leaked by Edward Snowden.
Yeah.
Do you think the NSA has gone too far in its data collection?
I think the NSA and I think big government in general has gone too far in terms of impeding on citizens' rights, especially when it comes to collection of data. I mean, we're looking at like a Hooverish administration here. How to change that? Well, how to change that is we have to stop putting ourselves in a military mindset where we're always fighting or attacking a war or somebody's attacking us. We need to look at it as, if we really do trust business and we really do trust commerce and we trust our citizenry, we've given them the citizen stamp of like, boom, you're an American citizen. We need to have that trust and that social contract. If that social contract deteriorates, we all need to look at that and say, why? Because that social contract should be the highest thing to us. It was for a long time, in the 50s, 60s, when you're an American citizen. When I became an American citizen, I mean, I cried. It's the biggest and best thing that can happen to you in the world right now.
The national debate over climate change, it's mentioned on your website. How severe a threat is it, sir?
I think it's a severe threat, and I think it should never leave the conversation. Everybody that becomes elected, the first thing we should ask them is, do you believe in science? If they say, yes, I do, and they can factually say, every scientist believes in global warming, every scientist knows that there's a climate shift happening. Is it caused by man? We can almost argue it's being accelerated by man-made functions or man-made science. Well, if it's a man-made problem, as JFK would say, there's a man-made solution.
Energy policy, do you support the Keystone Pipeline?
Currently, I do not. Currently, I do not. I think it's time for us to get off fossil fuels. The more we keep investing in that direction, the more we're taking off the table for solar and wind and new energies. There's electromagnetism. There's a number of things that we can tap into that we know about, that we've known about for 50 years.
Okay. Just two final questions. Is there any major issue that is central to your campaign I haven't asked about? Just anything you want to cover quickly?
I'm going to be honest. I think in southeastern Wisconsin and America abroad, we have to acknowledge that racism is still a situation that we're fighting. I've seen it in my district 9 out of 10 times. People will say, oh, Democrats are minorities, Republicans are white America. And that's not the truth. I mean, I would say Democrats are educated America and Republicans are, educated America, but they look at things differently. Racism is something that we should have gotten away from maybe in the 1960s, or the 1970s. But currently it still stands. People look on the surface before they look at your thoughts and ideas. Okay. And we need to fix that.
And finally, you're in your primary. You're up against Rob Durbin, who ran against Mr. Congressman Ryan 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. Do you want to highlight any differences between you and Mr. Durbin?
Absolutely. I think Rob is an incredibly nice guy. And I think anybody who runs sacrifices so much to run. In his situation, the biggest difference between Rob and I are, when people compare me to Ryan, there is a disparity, there's a contrast, which can pull a significant amount of vote out of, let's say, the inner city, or out of independents. I can reach across the aisle to independents and say, even if we're talking about guns, we can both agree on something, And I don't think Mr. Durbin has that ability. And it's been proven by the fact that he lost by 12%, which is a landslide loss, in an election year, a presidential election year, with $2 million. If you have $2 million, and we know that the whole of that district polls at only 3% leaning towards the Republicans, and you lose by 12, I don't think Paul is that strong. All these things that we're talking about today existed then. Did you do an effective job at managing your campaign? Did you take every dollar and spend it wisely? There's a big difference between what I do and what he does.
You don't sound like you're intimidated running against someone who was the vice presidential candidate of the Republican Party, Amar.
No, I'm not. I'm not. With Paul, it was interesting because on July 4th, he could have selected between different parades. The Racine Parade is one of the largest in the state, and it only allows incumbents. You can't come in as a challenger. So instead of Paul going there and really tearing the house down, he came to Oak Creek and stood in front of me.
Oh.
In a 30,000, I mean, that's a city that's only 30-some thousand people. And he paraded in front of me, and as he was getting booed, we were getting cheered. And I think that goes to show you, he knows where the fight is.
Thank you. Amar Kaleka of Franklin is a Democratic candidate in the 1st Congressional District. The primary is August 12th. Amar, thanks for talking to WisconsinEye.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank
Absolutely.
you.